that I had an opportunity to engage with. So I'd just like to introduce her name and say her name. And thank you all so much for being here. And I should say my gender pronouns are.
Next, we will, before we get into the panel questions, just like to read a poem that we felt was relevant to this whole panel. This poem is called Tradition by Jericho Brown. Aster nasturtium delphinium. We thought fingers in dirt, and it was our dirt. Learning names in heat, and elements classical philosophers said it could change us. Stargazer, foxglove. Summer seemed to block against the will of the sun, which reports claimed flamed hotter on this planet than when our dead fathers wiped sweat from their necks. Cosmos, baby's breath. Men like me and my brothers filmed what we planted for proof we existed before too late. Sped the video to blossom, brought in seconds. Colors you expect in poems where the world ends. Everything cut down. John Crawford, Eric Gardner, Mike Brown.
So we'd like to start with a few broad questions for all the panelists.
Okay, so our first question is, do you think there are any voices that are in danger of being drowned out during this push towards equality? And if so, how do you hope we can promote inclusivity in this movement?
Anyone can answer, yeah.
Absolutely. I think in a lot of movements, I remember that when in Ferguson first exploded back in 2014, there was a lot, there was a lot of conversation about Black men being targeted by the police, and it became like police violence became synonymous with Black men and only Black men. And then that's when Say Her Name became popularized, was like, well, actually, we're finding data that Black women are on the same death rates as Black men. So what we need to focus on the fact that this is being erased. But then that work got erased. And so now we've seen Say His Name, we've seen, and so that is kind of like this like cycle that is repeated, not just for Black women, but for Black trans women, for people, Black folks with disabilities, for Black folks out of incarceration, which is important because even when we talk about abolition as a whole, abolition is both the dismantling of the police, but it's also the dismantling of prison systems and acknowledging that mass incarceration is another form of slavery. And so it's definitely happening, and it requires a lot of acknowledgement of how it's just programmed in us inherently, which we're all inherently programmed to erase our most directly impacted people. So calling it out, one of our activist minister who goes out there and is marching is always emphasizing the importance of recognizing Black trans women and putting their names along all sides of all the other names who are victims of state-sanctioned violence or victims of internal community violence, and showing that out.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
I was just gonna say, absolutely, like 100% to everything else I just said. I think that when we think about movements in the past, I think that for me, when I've been involved as an organizer, it's really easy for people to get further away from those who are directly impacted, or for the movement being so excited to bring more people in that we forget to center Black folks, even if it is our movement, right? The conversation gets to being away from how Black about and moving towards the way how to make non-Black people comfortable, how to make white people feel safe in the space. And so I think that when we think about voices being drowned out, absolutely yes to Black women and Black trans women, and incarcerated individuals and those who are directly impacted, but also thinking about how do we continuously have the conversation and recenter it around Black folks and not about making other people comfortable, because that's not what it's about. And I think that as the movement evolves, as more people are hopping on and joining us, I think that that's something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I want to just agree and lift up Elsa and Shelley's contributions. In addition to Black trans, Black disabled, Black, all the different varieties of Blackness that we have in our community, I just want to add that sometimes with US organizing, what I've seen is just a focus on anti-Black racism as it relates to the United States context, in terms of the continental United States context, and we lose the broader context of US empire. So, making sure that we're including Puerto Rico, for example, making sure we're including the USVI, Guam, those countries, well, they're not countries actually. They're still colonies of the United States, unfortunately. And so when we're talking about organizing, we have to also recognize that there are different people entering the conversation from different positionalities. So really trying to focus on folks who are still also colonized, and then also the international community, and the way that US empire extends its arms into all countries around the globe. There's Black Lives Matter going on in continental Africa right now, in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia. And so I think with our organizing, even while we focus on the particular circumstances of racism in the United States context, we also take an international context so that we don't lose the broader global dismantling of white supremacy that we actually need to do.
The only thing I would add, but first would say that I agree, 100 and 1000% was always said before, is that, and another reason I'm appreciative that Elsa and Shelley are on this call as organizers is because I do feel like organizers have brought us to this moment. And as it becomes broader and these hashtags or these discussions become part of corporations or places like where I'm in university, there's a way in which the more radical, imaginative, and really bold and brave voices and perspectives of those who did the labor and the work to bring us to this moment, many times without a lot of fanfare, a lot of support, and in the shadows, that those become co-opted, right? And that we find a way to water down the demand. So I think that it's also critical that we keep a close eye on where the source of this energy and the brilliance comes from, so that we can do our best to have some fidelity to that, and to the people who have really been paying the price so that we can come into this particular moment.
Okay.
So, yeah, our next question was, on Instagram, we see a lot of these posts about, how you can learn through books and movies. So what were your guys' favorite recommendations for books, movies, or podcasts that we can all use to educate ourselves on racial inequality towards Black people? And what recommendations do you have for tools that Black people can use to unlearn and cope with any traumatic experiences that they've had?
And in addition, after all the other panelists answer this question, Ms. Alhassan has also prepared a few slides to go with this question. So.
No, I was just gonna say, I don't know if we actually want her to do her slides first, only because I got a peek of them, and a lot of the stuff I was gonna say is already on her slides. So great minds think alike.
Okay, so, we will share the slides first, and then if you guys have any additions, we'll do that.
So I can share my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I was just thinking of some different books that I really love, that I always sort of go back to in these moments. Toni Morrison, basically anything by Toni Morrison is great. So The Bluest Eye is just one of my all-time favorites, but it definitely breaks down some of these structures of racism, white supremacy, the way they operate, and also the internal dynamics of how we keep oppression within the Black community as well, and trying to break that down. Ama Ataidu, our sister Killjoy, does a more international perspective of African migrants in Germany, and she talks about sort of racism on a more global scale. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, was always something that whenever I've been organizing and struggle, it's always a book that we read for political education. We almost always start with The Fire Next Time. It's a book of essays. Audre Lorde, our Sister Outsider, is also a book of essays that we always use in struggle, particularly around questions of including LGBTQ folks in making sure that we're as inclusive as possible in terms of the movement. Keon Taylor from #Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation is a great book that really puts into perspective how Black Lives Matter got started. So if you're ever wondering what's the history behind the hashtag, behind the movement, she's a really great resource for that. And then Barbara Ransby, Making All Black Lives Matter, kind of updates the work that Keon Taylor does, so that we can understand what is really different and unique about Black Lives Matter organizing in this moment. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to the books before I go on. Okay, I'll just go to the next slide. Some recommended films are Banished, directed by Marco Williams. It talks about the ways that white vigilante violence has driven out African-American communities from their homes, from their land, historically. So if you want to know more about the Tulsa Massacre, Black Wall Street, as well as some of the other communities, Black communities that existed historically in this country, that would be a great film. It also talks about reparations. So if interested in learning more about restorative justice, it's a great film for that as well. It's a documentary. The Hate U Give is more of a fictional account directed by George Tillman Jr., but it basically recreates this scene of or active police violence, and then it's really about how a young Black girl comes into consciousness around her set of politics, and how she enters the movement. And then 13th is just a really great film in terms of if you want to know about US history in terms of race and white supremacy. 13th is a great film. As Elsa discussed in terms of abolition of the prison industrial complex, 13th really tackles that issue very well in the film. When They See Us is another film that also tackles the prison industrial complex. It's a fictional account of the Exonerated Five. Both of these films are directed by Ava DuVernay and are great films. And then Get Out is a horror film that really just challenges you to think about what white supremacy is doing to us psychologically and internally. So those are some films that I thought were really great at this time to sort of contextualize the moment that we're in. And then last, there are some community organizations that are really important in terms of this moment. The Movement for Black Lives encompasses Black Lives Matter. It also encompasses Dream Defenders, BYP 100, a lot of different Black organizations across the United States have all come under this platform of the Movement for Black Lives. And they have a whole policy platform. You can, Google their website and see different talking points, political education, and as well as getting involved and becoming a member of the Movement for Black Lives if you wish to. The African American Policy Forum, I think either Elsa or Shelley was mentioning about the Say Her Name campaign, when folks were realizing that we were just saying his name. The African American Policy Forum is the one that created that hashtag Say Her Name and started to collect the data on both the murder as well as abuse of Black women at the hands of the police. Black Trans Advocacy Coalition helps to lift up the voices of Black trans men and women, as well as genderqueer individuals, so that we are being as inclusive as possible in terms of our movement. And they have a number of policy objectives as well on their website. Black Visions Collective is the organization in Minnesota that helped to organize initially around the George Floyd protests, and also their work led to the Minneapolis Police Department disbanding. So they're a really great organization to watch the work that they're doing. Black Phoenix Organizing Collective, Mass Liberation Arizona, and Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro are all organizations that are locally based in Arizona that are doing a lot of the work in terms of the protests that are going on. And I'm sure Elsa can speak more specifically to some of those organizations. The Black Women and Girls Symposium is the organization that I'm a part of. We put on different symposiums. We've been trying to do it annually, where we invite Black women and girls to come and talk, share their stories. It's not just scholars, it's also community activists, and try to organize around sort of mentorship, self-care for Black women and healing for Black women and girls. The Rastafari Continental Council is an organization that's working on the continent right now in terms of making sure that diasporans who are living, so African diasporans or Black people who are living outside of Africa can come back to Africa. They're actually working on citizenship, getting citizenship for Black people who repatriated to different countries in continental Africa, and raising the voice and awareness of issues that specifically face diasporic Black individuals on the continent, as well as Rastafari communities on the continent. And then some other resources that I thought, if you're interested in just sort of Googling different YouTube webinars, there's a lot of really excellent webinars on YouTube that you can find around racism, anti-Blackness, reparations, restorative justice, decolonization, white supremacy. Basically, if you type in any of those, you'll find some really great resources come up. And that was it.
Okay. Do you mind making me the host again? And then we can get the other panelists' recommendations if they have any additional ones. Okay, do any of the other panelists have any thing to add to that?
Well, I brought this back to my group too, to Black Lives Matter. Like, hey guys, what do y'all want to recommend? One of us said Just Mercy for a movie, and American Violet was another movie. I recommend the book, and this movie's on Netflix actually. It's The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, because you get a lot of both of a little bit of Marsha's life, but you also get Sylvia Rivera's life and how they connected, and like what it felt like, what it was like to be the starter of a movement and then have that movement immediately erase you. So those are some good stuff. I also am a reader, but a lot of the books, if you are a reader, not a watcher, you can read The New Jim Crow instead of watching 13. It's kind of like what the 13 was based off of. And then an author from that book wrote another book called Building a Movement to End the New Jim Crow. If you were thinking about kind of the theories behind organizing, the difference between an organizer, an advocate, and an activist. That is an interesting book to read. If you're thinking about learning a little bit more about prison and prison abolition and prison stories, there's a book called Chained in Silence, and the subtitle is Black Women in Convict Labor. That I realize I'm not saying any of these authors' names. I'll probably put it in the chat. That's what I'm gonna do. Put it all in the chat. My bad. I got one more, and it's actually from the same author that Shamara shared, Keon McGuire, How We Get Free, Black Feminism, and it also includes the Combahee River Collective. That the River Collective statement is probably one of the most powerful statements ever written. So you can also just read that statement, which you could Google and find for free. Looking into, I'm huge, I'm also huge on immigrant rights and people who are externally and internally displaced rights. So there's a book called We Are Not Refugees that looks like this. I actually have this book physically. Most of the other books I have on Kindle, but then that also goes into talking about people who are and hearing from them directly their stories about being displaced. I think that's all I got. But to answer the second part of that question, how to best process as Black folks what's going on and how to learn more deeply about what's going on. One of our healing ministers, so the way Black Lives Matter is separated, we kind of modeled the Black Panthers in separating ourselves in ministries. And one of our ministries is community wellness and healing, because it's important to center our healing. And our healing minister said that it's important that Black folks, not just Black folks and people who are allies, don't just see us as oppressed individuals, but as full human beings and understanding the replications of what that means. And that we're worthy of a life free of oppression, with a full involvement of joy, creativity, and that we're not just this press group that needs to be saved, but we're humans that deserve the fullness of humanity. So shout out to Hanan, our minister, that shared that, wanted me to share it with you guys.
I love that. Thank you both for all of those amazing resources. For me, when I think about movement building, I like to listen directly from the people who have been in the fight. And so I'm a real big fan of autobiographies, and just listening or reading about the stories of individuals and what they went through or how they even got to be who they are. I think when we think about movement builders, we think that like they were born great people and that they were born with these certain attributes. And then once you read their stories, you actually realize that they also had a process of awakening and growing into their own power. And so I think if you can Google any of huge movement builders or activists in their autobiographies, these two are my favorite, and I dropped them in the chat. And so highly recommend autobiographies. I also wanted to just go back to the organizations and just like double click on how important it is to support our local organizations and the work that is happening on the ground, and the people who are doing that work. I think that I've been following a lot of Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro's work, Mass Liberation Arizona, Phoenix Local Organizing Committee, Justice or Else, which is another organization that I dropped in the chat. They are doing a lot of amazing grassroots work. And I feel like, I said this earlier, but I do think that the more we organize, the easier it is to get away from why we started organizing in the first place. And I think these organizations do a really, really good job at centering the people who are most affected and lifting up their voices. So shout out to Elsa for being a part of one of those organizations. And then going back to the question about Black folks and how to cope and how to decolonize, I think something for me personally that has been really fruitful is just surrounding myself around folks who have an elevated mindset who can get me there, right? Because I think, again, we like to think that everybody is there and everyone's in that mindset, but I was not thinking about abolition 3 years ago or 4 years ago, right? I had to get to that thinking by being surrounded by folks who had been doing the work for a while or who had been starting their own process of decolonizing their mind. And so I think the more we can surround ourselves with other folks who are doing the work and who are committed to asking ourselves questions, right? Like, why did I say that? Why do I think that way? What was I taught, right? Like that process of unlearning is super important, and just being willing to go there. That's all I got.
Okay, let's move on to our next question.
Real quick, I'm so sorry. I forgot. I knew I forgot something. So I have also a list of local organizations that we work with as Black Lives Matter. These are all people that support the abolition platform. And I'm just gonna list them. There's the Arizona Poor People's Campaign, Arizona Stands, Black Mothers Forum, Black Phoenix Organized Collective was already mentioned, CHISPA, East Valley, NACP. I can always have a hard time saying their name. NAWCP. Ooh, I still messed it up. Phoenix Localizing, we call them LOC, Phoenix Local Organizing Collective Committee, the Maricopa branch of NAWCP, Poder in Action, Mass Liberation was already mentioned, Poetic Soul Open Mic, and Transcorp Pueblo. So those are just some of the organizations we work with on a regular basis. So yeah, we're actually starting now also to work with the South Phoenix Planning Committee to prevent some gentrification happening in South Phoenix. But, yeah.
Well, that kind of segues into our next question too. Are there any organizations that are like your guys' favorites that help like support racial equality that you recommend people like get involved with or donate to? You guys kind of touched on this, but if there are any others. Okay. If not, we can go on to the next question.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we started this panel was because a lot of us couldn't go out and actually protest because of COVID-19. So what do you recommend we as like the youth do to help besides just donating and signing petitions? And what do you guys see as the youth's role as the future of this movement?
So I guess I'll start. So youth historically have always led these mass movements and mobilizations. Civil rights movement, Black Panthers, you can go down the list. It's all young people that are doing this organizing. So people around your age. And it is unfortunate that it's like the perfect storm of things where we're in a global pandemic right now. So I know that it can feel like, oh, well, I should be out in the street. But I know that some folks have underlying conditions. I actually just had a baby 2 months ago. So, I can't really be, out in the street, but what you can do so a number of actions that different organizations have put together for folks who cannot go out in the street. So the Movement for Black Lives, for example, this weekend organized with it's like the National Poor People's Campaign, and they had like a march on Washington that you could participate in virtually. So you had folks that were actually going to Washington, but then you had also the virtual participants that were doing that work. I think it's Black Phoenix Metro, and Elsa, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, had a call-in where you could call your local Congress members, senators, as well as council members on any number of local injustices in terms of organizing around Deion Johnson, as well as the number of other, sometimes I'll lose track of all the names, which is rather unfortunate. A number of other folks who've been murdered or who have been abused by the Phoenix Police Department, as well as the Tucson Police Department. So there are some things that you can do in terms of just organizing from within your own home. The other things to do is political education. Take this opportunity to really educate yourself on the issues. If you don't know what abolition means, for example, use some of the resources that were recommended, talk to some folks that are part of these different organizations, do what you're doing like right now in terms of organizing this webinar, right, to educate yourself on a number of these issues. So there are things that you can do in your home. And then the other thing to also think about is we're living in a time of genocide. This is a genocide, right? This is mass killing of Black people, people of color on a systematic level. And so if you are a Black person who's just taking care of yourself, right, and practicing self-care, self-love in this moment, taking care of your family, calling your friends to check in on them, calling your family members to check in on them, You know, Keon mentioned, you know, I think your grandmother, right? At the beginning of the call, calling on the older people in our lives, calling on the ancestors, doing that sort of spiritual work as well as healing work in your own circle of friends and community members is also really important work and should not be discounted, right? I think one of the things that we often learn when we read sort of books about the organizing that went on in the civil rights or the Black Panther era was that there was a lack of self-care in some of these community organizations. And that's something I think is really being centered in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black Lives, has really tried to take healing and wellness seriously and as a sort of a radical impetus to the work that we're doing. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry, were you gonna say something else? Oh, is it okay? I also want to mention earlier, Shamara, I hope when I called out Shelley and Elsa for their organizing work, I didn't mean to erase your work as an organizer in any way. And I want to be transparent about the fact that I'm not an organizer, and why I try as hard to defer to those who have an organizing expertise and history in doing that work. What I would add, and just to build off a little bit of Shamara's comment, is to commend both of you all for even organizing this panel, right? Like, I think that that in and of itself is doing something. I think there's a way in which we receive history because of, in part because of this notion of patriarchy, where there's like these grand stories of these grand men. So we only hear about like the one person who made the difference, right? And so as you all open up the conversation, so much labor is so many individuals, their work is really erased, right? And we don't hear about them, and it's as if their contributions never mattered. And so I think the other side of that is that, at least for myself, I know that it's something I even have to wrestle with now, probably, but to some degree less of an extent, which is that you don't feel like you're doing enough unless you are doing what these grand narratives represent, right? And that the only way to make a serious contribution is to do something on that's read as spectacular, right? And I think probably like the notion of, or this like propensity to try to go viral to a certain extent. And I don't mean that just like in a younger generational thing. I mean like globally, right? This idea of like both corporations, large organizations are always trying to like do something on a mass scale, that we lose attention to the everyday relationships that we have. And so the last thing I'll say that kind of also connects back to the last question around healing, which is very important to me, is, one of the things we could do is create these circles and these moments and community spaces to actually focus on healing. So that could be gathering to listen to music. It could be gathering to share stories of our histories. It could be gathering to interview our elders, to hear about their struggles. So we have a little bit more of appreciation, I think, and generosity to things that we may see as compromises that they made, but we have a better context for their lives and their struggles. I think centering those things that help us feel brilliant, beautiful, allow us to establish healthy intimacy among our communities is extremely important.
Yeah, I would double click on everything that everyone just said. A lot of the times when people ask me how they can contribute, I think of the 3 T's that we actually use a lot in like political spaces, and I've been trying to bring them a little bit more to social justice spaces, which are time, talent, and treasure, right? So those are like 3 different ways that I like to categorize how people can get involved. So time meaning continuing to sign those petitions, right? Making sure that you're scheduling time out of your day to make the calls and contribute in the actions that the organizations that are leading that we trust. If you are able to vote, then voting, making sure that you're exercising your voice in that way. Spreading the word and doing your political education, right? So doing the readings, sharing your thoughts, letting people in on your thought process and how you are politicizing yourself and radicalizing yourself to the movement. Having those tough conversations with your family and friends, having tough conversations with yourself, right? Because Black folks also have some work to do as well. If you are able, and can be out in the streets and being able to protest as well. Your talent, meaning offering your skill sets and whatever it is that you bring to the table. For example, I have a lot of dancer friends who right now are holding classes. They're holding dance classes and being able to allocate those funds to local organizations or to movements that are happening across the country right now. I also have another friend who is a photographer and a videographer, and I connected him with the Phoenix LLC, and he's helping them on some like videography work, right? So like, what talent do you have? Are you able to write grants? Can you do some admin work, right? Like, what other talent do you have that you may think is not an asset that you can actually offer to the movement? So just keeping things like that in mind. And then treasure, right? Like, what kind of money can you up? Because these movements are expensive. When we think about the bail fund wasn't created for funsies. It's because people will get arrested and we do need money to get them out. Also, when we think about taking care of each other, a lot of the times we need to take care of each other by providing tangible things like food and money and housing, right? And so money allows us to keep our movement going in other sustainable ways. And so I always think like the 3 T's are a great way to like think about how you can contribute. And then also recognizing that like it all starts with us, and that looks different for each person, that looks different for each community. And as Keon said, like, you all just taking the first step in like having this panel is such a contribution, I'm sure, for all the participants who are on here, right? And so continuing to brainstorm and think about how do you organize, how do you contribute to the movement is important, and it looks different for everyone. There's no right, there is a wrong way, so I'm not going to say there's no wrong way, but I will say that as we are thinking about where's our place, that like taking the first step is so important, and I commend both of you for like taking that first step and like providing the space for people to learn.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to we have a few brief questions for each of the panelists individually, and first we will be starting with Keon. So,
Mr. McGuire, you said you work at ASU and you've taught there for about 7 years. So what is it like to work as a Black professor in a predominantly white institution? Are there any like memorable experiences where you felt like you were directly impacted by your race or ethnicity?
Yeah, super wild is what it's like. You know, are you two from Arizona?
yes, sir.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, I'm from the Southeast, so I like when you say like yes sir and Mister, it takes me back to like the Southern. You know what I'm saying? So I understand and respect, but I appreciate the question. So I'll answer it. So part of the predominantly white context in general, I think, can be difficult. This is the first time I lived in a city in the state that has a lower percentage of Black folks, again, because I actually moved here from Philadelphia, which is really Black, and I was born and raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, which actually, as Shamara mentioned earlier, talking about Banish, Wilmington was the home of the 1898 race riots, that, you know, when there was like a Black middle political class that was literally burned to the ground because of that, right, by white vigilantes. So I grew up with that history. So I would say that I'm meandering now. Let me try to bring it back. So it is very difficult. It's extremely difficult, right? But at the same time, I think that what has been sustaining is that I'm very much I believe fundamentally in community, right? So I often say like the only thing we have is community. So whether that's a family that we inherit or a family that we choose. And so what has allowed me to have a sense of sanity, have a sense of stability, a sense of wholeness, has been the communities that I've invested in and that has invested in me. And therapy has also helped, right? That is something I think has been critical for my social, emotional, and mental health. But there are definitely struggles. And so as you can see, like, I'm young, I look younger than what I am. So there's already that. I'm the only, for a long time, I was, I think, the only Black professor in my entire college of like, I don't know, 60, 70 faculty. And then when I wear, depending on how I dress, right? Like, so I went into my office one day. I'll share this quick story and I'll stop. I went into my office one day and I was wearing my X hat, my Malcolm X hat, and my white t-shirt, which is what I like to wear most of the time. And I was actually inviting a faculty member into the office. who hadn't been there for a year. And I went to shake their hand and they recoiled and they were like, who are you? What are you doing here? Right. And the way that they talked to me was so wild that even my neighbor, coworker down the hall came out later, was like, are you cool? Like, are you okay? Right. So there's always this way of which I'm seen as not being belonging, even though it's like both this like hyper visibility and invisibility at the same time. And to me, that is just what it might mean to live in a predominantly white context. And there's always a way in which I have to outperform, my colleagues who just honestly don't have the same type of pressures to deliver, right, in the same type of ways. And so again, going back to the community, one thing that is intellectually has saved me is I read more recently, like in the last 5 to 6 years, about maroon communities. And I don't live clearly outside of our system to fully develop a maroon community, but those concepts of building communities that have values that are completely against the values of the dominant context. So instead of individualism, believe in more collectivism and cooperation. Instead of like hoarding resources, how do we share resources among our collective? So and beyond. Instead of competition, we think about how can we support each other to our various goals and aspirations, and how do we affirm each other. Instead of kind of like tearing each other down, we think about how do we build each other up with love. So that's been a way in which I've negotiated, but I would be lying if I say it's not wild. But I'll say this and this stuff. I also grew up in like a really, really working class family. So we have like a hard line between work and family. So there's like a lot of stuff that happens at work that I'm just like, that's just work stuff. Like I'm not giving thought to it. I'm not gonna let them, take my soul to this job. So I have to invest in other things that keep me whole.
Okay, and just so we can be respectful of people's time, I'm gonna remind the panelists just to try to keep things a bit briefer. Our next question. As many probably already know, that heteronormativity is perpetuated within the Black community. So we were wondering if you've ever seen this manifested on college campuses, and additionally, how do you think like the Black youth should begin to start dismantling this in their own households and communities?
That's to the panel, right?
That's to you. So sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. So yes, I've seen it. So I'll just give myself as an example in a 30-second thing. I try to like every 2 to 3 years identify a growth area for me. So when I got to Philly, that growth area was to engage more with Black feminist writing and women of color writing. And I had to think very different, as Shelley said earlier, what do I need to unlearn? So unlearning for me was patriarchy, right? Unlearning for me was cisgender privilege. Unlearning for me was heterosexual privilege. Growing up, particularly in the Bible Belt South, that like as a highly educated Black male, there were certain privileges that people just wanted to give to me, and how do I fight against those things, right? To not invest in that. So that's so reading people like Bell Hooks, Patricia Collins, Audre Lorde, Marsha P. Johnson, as was shared earlier, I think were critical part of my unlearning.
So our last question for you, Mr. McGuire, would you be able to comment on stereotypes about like Black people in higher education, like affirmative action, and its effects on like students in higher education? And if possible, would you also be able to comment on like the imposter syndrome in Black students in academia?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the imposter syndrome, which if I can recall, I was reading something a little while ago that it initially started off as a critique of a context. So it wasn't individualized as like an individual has an imposter syndrome. It was like the context in which an individual exists creates in them an idea that they're an imposter, right? And it's something that I struggle with in every context that I moved into, right? So I do think that's a real thing. So there's many stereotypes. Probably the biggest one I'll say, which is there's that Toni Morrison quote that's very popular, which is the serious function of racism is a distraction. And I feel like that was a term for me during my graduate studies in Philadelphia. I spent a lot of time trying to prove myself, defend the work that I do, the research that I do, the way that I teach. And so there's always like this defensive, there's reactionary position. And now what I try to do is to divert my energy more to creativity, into more constructive building that does not center white supremacist gaze and the norm as something I have to respond to, right? It's actually something I don't have to talk to, right? I can actually talk to a community of people and individuals who don't take my humanity, or who take my humanity as a given instead of trying to defend my humanity.
Okay, now we will move on to our questions for Ms. Alhassan. So first, how do you feel about teaching about the spiritual practices of a tribe of Black women in a field that seems to be dominated by like white male philosophers and philosophies?
Yeah, I mean, I think Keon kind of emphasized this point, but academia is a sort of the cornerstone of epistemic racism, right? We're about producing knowledge. That's what the university is supposed to be for. My profession, professors, are supposed to produce knowledge, produce new knowledge. And from at least since 1492, the European Academy, as well as once the United States was created, the United States Academy has been dominated by a Eurocentric point of view. So it's been dominated as believing the opinions, the philosophies, the knowledge production of white men. So trying to counter that and say that, well, Rastafari women, Black women are knowledge producers, are philosophers, are intellectuals, is an insurrectionary notion, right? That some of my colleagues, some of them, look favorably upon, and some of them don't, because it demands a decolonizing of the current state of the university, to say that we're going to decenter whiteness and center Black voices, Black women's voices, right? So, it's definitely been a challenge, but it's something that I'm committed to doing.
So another question, since you have expertise in both gender and sexuality and African American studies, can you comment or explain Misogynoir and how the Rastafari women combat this, or any other anti-Black gendered racism?
Yeah, Misogynoir is a terminology that was created, I think in, I'm gonna forget the actual year. But it was basically created to talk about the ways that Black women experience both racism and sexism simultaneously. So for a very long time, as Keon mentioned, in a lot of Black organizations, Black spaces, you had a focus on patriarchy, Black masculinity as being sort of the thing that we're trying to, fight for in terms of Black men being included in particular types of spaces. Since that time, folks have evolved to know that it's not just Black men that are the cornerstone of the Black community. There are Black women, there are all of the different arrays of Blackness, Black trans folks, LGBTQ folks, disabled folks, incarcerated folks. All of these people need their voices lifted up in the community. So the term anti-Black gender racism or misogynoir are just terminologies to highlight the racism and sexism that Black women experience.
Okay, and on to our last question for you. And then would you mind explaining what exactly critical race theory is, and then commenting on it in the context of private institutions, and if you think there are any ways we can dismantle these systems to basically lift up people of color, and specifically Black people of color?
Yeah, and I actually forgot the second part of the last question, to say what Rastafari women are doing to organize against anti-Black gender racism.
Yeah.
Rastafari women are producing their own canon of knowledge that needs to be engaged by folks outside of just Rastafari women, which is what is the work that I'm trying to do, as well as the work that they're trying to do in terms of centering both spirituality as well as fighting against anti-Blackness globally. In terms of the question about critical race theory is just the notion of connecting law with racism. So you're studying the legal system, you're thinking about the legal system, and you're thinking about the way that racism plays a role in that. So a lot of the discussions that we are engaged in right now in terms of abolishing the police, or even just the notion of policing itself, is based and rooted in critical race theory, trying to think about the way that the law is racist. And so if the law is racist, how do we abolish, dismantle those laws and put a system in place that is egalitarian for everyone, and that can provide restorative justice for aggrieved communities like Black and Brown communities, nationally as well as internationally. And then predominantly white private institutions.
Yeah, that works.
Predominantly white private institutions have a role in decolonizing their own spaces. I was watching a webinar on YouTube, actually, Scholars for Social Justice put up this webinar talking about the need to talk about not only dismantling statues and abolishing the police, but also thinking about how to abolish the actual university structure itself, how to decolonize the actual university structure itself, which is rooted in this epistemic racism that I spoke about previously. And so both private and public institutions have a role to play in thinking about how to provide reparations, restorative justice, how to decolonize spaces, how to center Black voices, and eradicate anti-Black gender racism.
Okay, then we're going to move on to our questions for Ms. Gebreyohanes. So the first one is, with a lot of talk about defunding the police, we wanted to ask you if you could explain what exactly this would entail and what exactly this means, and like, what are the first steps towards redistributing police funding?
I love this question because it's really popular right now, and it's actually being used in context of reform, which is not what defunding the police is about. But to probably back to connect us to that question, you said, what can the youth do now? And I think defunding the police is important to seeing what the youth have already done, with like what that the youth shape culture, like y'all shape culture. That's what y'all do. And like back in 2017, we were also saying defund the police. Back in the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement in the 60s, they were saying defund the police. But going back to 2017, we were like, how are we gonna shift culture? How are we gonna convince the public that the police ain't it, that the police do not, they don't serve anybody but white folks? How do we do that? And then fast forward to now, you have like all over TikTok, Instagram, that the hashtag all like ACAB all over, and we're like, whoa, this makes it a lot. This makes it a lot easier to get to that point of like, oh yeah, the culture, let's shift it, let's use this and pilot off of that to like, this is why we said it then, it's why we're saying it now. It's why it's important. Defunding the police is the first step into creating the world without police. So when we think about our movement and liberation movement, 25% of it is dismantling, is taking down the current system. 75% is building, and it's building that world that's going to be there to replace, ready, set up to replace what we already took down. The reason for this is that if we don't work on that building, but we destroy everything, then that allows fascism to like take over and destroy any of that dismantling that we did. So to be strategic, we don't want to just get rid of police. We want to enhance our communities. We want to make sure our communities are healthy and have what they need to succeed, to prevent people going into the police system, to prevent hunger, to prevent homelessness, and to prevent any type of mental health crises, and to support our undocumented people that are being continuously ignored by the federal government. So that is when we say defund the police, we mean that money that we are continuously putting, all of our tax dollars that we're continuously giving to the city, that they're using on a police department to kill us. That's about 60% of the city budget. We want that money to actually go to us. And that's what defunding the police means. It's the first step to completely abolishing the police. It's not, well, let's change up the police and give them some training. And they had years to reform. They wasted their time. It's about moving them out and putting in community safety measures that are accountable and created by community.
So another question we had for you was, how do you see non-Black allies' roles in the Black Lives Movement matter? Like, should they be taking different approaches to allyship? Because many people struggle with wanting to raise awareness, but like not wanting to drown out Black voices. So how do you suggest allies go about this?
That we actually do some train. Sometimes you'll look on our social media and we'll put out, we're doing a BLM 101 for non-Black POCs, or we're doing a BLM 101 for white folks. And the idea here is to make it clear that for white people particularly, the role is to follow the leadership of Black leadership, to give your money, reparations, and to, if you're able to go to the protest, to use your body as a human shield, because you will not be attacked by the police the same ways that we will be attacked. And so that are the three different things. We also have white folks act as legal observers. If you don't know what a legal observer is, all they do is they watch what the interactions with the police. They take notes. They get the name and birthday of whoever gets arrested, so that we can make sure we can get them out of jail. And these are different things that white folks can do. Same goes for non-Black people of color participating and joining us, joining our movements, is following, sharing our posts, calling when we're making those call outs. A lot of the actions that we're doing now are actually calling the city council, or all the city council movements, because they're trying to throw their budgets under the window, like, oh, let's just throw these out, while they're marching. And it's like, nope, let's call them up, let's answer, let's demand that we want these budget changes to reflect what's going on in the community, what's going on in the streets. And those are just different things that you can do. But the key thing here is to not get defensive, follow the leadership.
Okay, and then our last question for you is, have you seen any, with the growing attention going to the Black Lives Matter movement during this time, we've noticed that there are a lot of misconceptions about it. So would you mind like discussing any or like debunking any that you've heard?
I think the most common one is that we're a terrorist organization. I've heard that. But I'm also East African and first generation American, so I've been called a terrorist my whole life. So not too crazy. It does change a little bit how we organize, because we are on the FBI wanted list, and so that changed a little bit how we do things. I think a key thing here, I think there's a lot, like any type of Black radical movement, any type of Black liberation movement is gonna have it's all kinds of hate, saying that we're violent, that we're terrorists, we're unpatriotic, whatever that they throw at us. But honestly, I think one of the most harmful things is that we're an organization that thinks reform is possible, and it's not. Like, being an abolitionist is focusing and centering Black liberation, understanding that anti-Blackness is the center and the foundation of both white supremacy and oppression as a whole. And that when you free Black trans women, Black disabled people, Black people, and all Black people, you also free everybody else. And so we center this and we acknowledge this, then that we are understanding that Black liberation and abolition is the way to go. We're not here to make a deal or kneel or shake hands with the police, because we're centering Black liberation.
So for our last panelist, Ms. Shelley Jackson, we were wondering if you could explain a little bit more about organizing corps and why this, like why it's important in the modern day and how people can get involved in it.
Yes. So a lot of my organizing background has been at the intersection of social justice movements and issue-based organizing and grassroots organizing, while also intersecting with electoral organizing and making sure that we have the people in office that can push those needs forward from the community and represent the interests of the community. And so Organizing Core 2020 is a national organization that essentially had one mission, which was to recruit, train, and retain 1,000 organizers that would eventually work on the presidential election for whoever the Democratic nominee was, right? So the organization actually started at the summer of last year when there were like 1,000 candidates and so many people running, right? And the organization began training all these people in the battleground states, right? So Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and the list goes on. And so we centered young people and reaching out to folks who were young to try to get them involved, and also reaching out to folks who were Black, Brown, Indigenous, because we know that looking at electoral organizing, usually these folks are left out because the pay is not there, right? And not everyone can say F my life for a few months and go work on a campaign, right? And so this was an organization that we were able to provide stipends for the folks who were taking the training. And then once they were done with our program, we ramped them on to become organizers. And so that is what Organizing Core has been about. I have been the coach here in Arizona, training the folks here, and have been able to train a few folks in North Carolina as well. And so this is so important mainly because when we think about past presidential elections, we have seen that in my experience, at least in electoral organizing, it's really easy to think about the numbers and not the people, right? It's about how many doors did you knock? How many people did you talk to? What do the polls look like? Instead of centering the needs and the voices of the people who are actually going to be most affected by these policies, depending on who gets in office, right? And so I found my work at Organizing Core really important because we were able to train folks in a way of always centering people. And our organizers are essentially the folks who mobilize the volunteers, right? Get more people into the door, and are able to bring in folks who are usually left out. So we know that in a presidential election, there are a whole bunch of other moving parts happening, but the organizers are the ones who are on the ground and who are having those tough conversations. And so I think that the work that we were able to do there has been great. And actually the organization is in the phase of ramping down. So I do not work with Organizing Core anymore, but we are ramping down because now we have a presidential nominee and organizers are being placed onto the presidential. And so right now we are ramping down and organizers are being placed. And the goal is that at the end of this election, they'll probably ramp back up to continue training folks and getting more people in the door for elections in the future.
Okay, our next question. So we saw that you spoke for another organization that talked about like political efficacy. And we were wondering if you could give any advice to any young adults who are just getting to vote and might be overwhelmed with the decision. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that voting is such a nuanced, complex conversation, and people hate to think of it that way. They think it's so easy and say, well, just go vote. When the truth is that, especially when we think about Black people and Indigenous folks and women, right, we were not always granted the right to vote. When we think about the start of history, at first, the only way you can vote is if you had land. And then it was if you were white. And then it was if you were white and a woman, right? And so there's a lot of reasons why Black folks, Indigenous folks don't feel like voting is for them. And I think we can think about that for young people as well. When the older generations are saying, oh, young people don't do this, X, Y, and Z, right? So it is a very complex situation. But for me, I think what has been helpful when trying to mobilize young people is giving them people and places to follow. I think Mass Liberation Arizona has been doing a great job on doing like little town halls with Maricopa County attorneys or those who are running for Maricopa County attorney. And I think like those are organizations that we can follow to see what are the facts, what are candidates saying, because we want to take our vote seriously. We want to make sure we're voting for the right people, and it's easy for information to get misconstrued. But I think that we can follow organizations who are creating the platform for us to receive that information. And then once you have that, I think you're able to make an informed vote moving forward.
Okay, now we will open up the floor for anyone who has any questions for the panelists. You can either type them in the chat, or you can go to participants on your screen and raise your hand if anyone had any questions. And while people type out their questions, to like start wrapping up the panel, we were wondering if any of the panelists had any commentary on their visions for the future of this movement, like their hopes, their worries, anything to really just like engulf how you're feeling about everything going on. Okay, actually we can start with the questions in the chat first, and then we can do the overall hopes and dreams. So first from Mr. Howard Matz. Currently we are hearing these talking points about taking action in regards to police reform. Some are saying we should defund the police, some are saying we should abolish the police, others are saying that the police system is systemically racist, and some say that police make America a better place. I would just like to know the specific approach of the Black Lives Matter movement in regards to police reform.
So we don't believe in police reform because the police historically are a product of slavery, and are a continuation of funneling in people into the new slave system, which is in mass incarceration. So we actually believe in redistributing that money that is given to police back to community. So that means the first step to that is defunding the police and putting it into community programmings. And then the next step, of course, is engaging with community and figuring out and creating new accountable, community accountable organizations and networks to better support and all of the facets to create community wellness and safety.
So another question from the chat was, over the past several weeks, we've seen a lot of rioting, looting, and taking down of many prominent statues. Does the Black Lives Matter movement condemn or support these actions, and why?
So it's important to note that the Black Lives Matter movement isn't a one movement. We're the local chapter here in Phoenix, but there's there's BLMs in almost every city, not almost every city, but almost every state. There's two just in Arizona, because there's one here, and there's also one in Tucson, and there's global. And so there is no one message. Like, I can't speak for all of the Black Lives Matter of the world. I will say there is no right or wrong response to oppression. If people are angry, they have a right to be. There's no right or wrong way to respond to finding out on a constant basis that people who look like you are being murdered by the state. So that's my answer.
Okay, and then the last question. Oh, there's another question. There has been a lot of talk on black crime, how the BLM movement rarely addresses that issue. Is this because the BLM movement solely aims to target racism and not separate issues that are not about racism or racial discrimination? Because I think many people would argue that black on black crime is a huge issue in America.
Only racists argue that black on black crime is a huge issue in America. Black on black crime is a logical fallacy, and not relevant to the state sanctioned violence. the plot, like when your government is attacking you, that's what we are addressing. Like we're continuously dealing with state-sanctioned violence and fighting against that. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. We're about Black liberation.
Yeah, I just also want to say I was going to drop in the make sure it's the right thing I'm dropping in first in the chat box. There was this link going around the other day, which is like a study group for abolitionist ideas. If you're new to abolitionist, so there's a list of resources that goes through week by week. And as someone myself who needs to read more and learn more about the history of the ideas, I've only engaged it minimally. So to kind of just to go back to one of the comments that were made earlier.
So I think our last question, in order to get involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, I have to first understand and identify the discriminatory actions against Black people in America. So in what ways are Black people racially discriminated against today in the status quo of America?
So racism is in every facet of American system, society, and culture. So that question, going back to the resources that was provided by this panel and reading through some of those books, watching some of those movies, and then giving a little bit more on your part to research the history. We are focused on fighting on the ground and creating that bigger that world for Black liberation, how that looks like and designed by Black folks. So that work on researching how racism affects Black people and how racism is inherently like the foundation of this nation, that's going to be on you to do. So you can use the resources provided by us, or you can find some other resources online.
So as Amara mentioned earlier, the closing remarks, if you guys have anything that you want to mention about what you want to see this movement go towards, or what you want to see the future of this movement be, you guys can talk about that now.
So I know I've definitely been so joyful in terms of seeing folks, Black and brown folks, white folks, all types of different people go out in the street and raise up the voices of Black trans lives, Black women, Black men who've been murdered systematically by the state, which is why I call it a genocide. It's something that we've been doing for years, and it's just great to see that folks are continuing to do that work. My hope is that, not necessarily my hope, I don't want to say my hope. What I know is going to happen is we will defeat this in our lifetime. We will defeat this in this lifetime. We will win this lifetime. This will not continue generationally. But it can only happen that way if all of us do our part. I liked Shelley's thing about the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. That's great. You know, do whatever you can do that's in your capacity to do to help to defeat this. As Elsa mentioned, racism, anti-Blackness is the bedrock of this nation, right? This nation is built on the genocide of Indigenous communities and the enslavement of Black communities, right? And so in order to dismantle that, it means that we need to dismantle and unlearn, do that work of unlearning, as Keon mentioned in his commentary, all of the different ways that we've learned anti-Blackness over time immemorial. When if you look back into the books that you read in elementary school, Snow White, you know, what you know, Disney movies, the different cartoons, you know, Paw Patrol, you know, teaching our children that the police are somehow good and somehow going to protect you. All of these types of notions are intertwined with white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so trying to dismantle it, that's why you see people organizing from everything around Aunt Jemima, the pancake, you know, box image, to, you know, NFL coming out to make statements around racism, to, you know, different corporations, as Keon mentioned. Folks are coming out because they know that they have a direct lineage in terms of racism and racialization in this country, and they have been responsible for permeating a lot of these racist notions and perpetuating white supremacy. And so what I know is that we will win, and to keep faith, to practice your whatever community healing and wellness rituals that you have for yourself and with your family. All of those things are important at this time. You know, as we see the images, the graphic images of people dying, it's difficult and we can get discouraged. But people organizing and pushing forward is what keeps me hopeful and keeps and knowing that we will win in this lifetime, that we will dismantle white supremacy.
I can go. This has been such a fruitful conversation. And if I don't see any of the other panelists or the two lovely young ladies who put this together again, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this virtual space with me and everyone else who's on here. Something I'm excited to see is just the continued evolving of our thinking, of our imagination, and getting back to what it was, right? I think that recently for me, I have noticed how much I say but, or how much I like go back to reality. And it's like, well, what is reality? Who created reality? And what was put in my head as I was growing up to say that I can't do this or we can't do this. And so I have been indulging in Afrofuturism books and authors like Octavia E. Butler, who has helped me begin to just imagine again and think about the possibilities of what this can look like. And I think we can do that again by following abolitionist organizations and organizers where this thought has came from anyway. But I'm super excited to see how as a culture and as a movement, we continue to imagine and reimagine and continue to put those imaginations not only in our heads, but into policy and in place as new systems as we continue on with this movement. Including reparations.
I love everything that was said. I extremely love that you said that we're gonna end it in this lifetime. I want to just like say, I want to like highlight that. I don't know how many times I tell people that, and they're just like looking at me like, what you like they allow this idea that racism is like a human nature thing. Like it's not. It was made. We have a particular date when it was created, and it was created to make slavery. We ain't slaves no more, so we don't need to have white supremacy continue in our lifetime. So I'm excited for the building that we're all doing. That is something that I'm real excited for.
Yeah, so I would the only thing I would add, in addition to agreeing with everything that was said, I want to double. I think Shelley said earlier, double tap on everything that was said. So I'll double tap on the reading Afrofuturist work. My partner and I, we try to read like at least 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 Afrofuturist texts a year, so that we can keep our imagination and our dreams fresh. And the way I would say is just that that people will just have a better quality of life in every sense of the word, that they have access to rest, to joy, to healing, to leisure, to community, to good food, to not be harassed and imprisoned and thrown away and discarded, to not be murdered, right? There are just so many things that I think that what we count, and even myself, because of many of the conditions I grew up in, as like, this is just life and this is what it has to be, that I don't think that I hope and challenged by Shamara's statement, believe that we will win, so that people can have access to this quality of life, and that we move away from this idea that only a very small few people globally can have a good life, right? Like, and out of this kind of scarcity mindset, and think more about how can everyone share in things that should just be granted as a human right.
Okay, I believe that finishes our panel. So I just want to say thank you to everyone that joined. And thank you to our panelists. So, yeah.
And thank you. You two are like, this was amazing. Like, I would have, this is just super dope. Like, thank y'all for all the work that y'all put in. I know it only shows up in this moment, but y'all clearly like we're talking, studying our websites and our like CVs or resumes and came up with very targeted questions. So thank y'all for this labor of love and this generosity to the community that you all have given to all of us here. Thank y'all so much for what y'all did on a Saturday in the summer. Like, that's super dope. So thank y'all.
Thank you. So I will be ending the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.